So for the next session, I would like to invite here Kate Armstrong and Davide. Amato, great, part of our team.
Thank you. As you want. Hi everyone. We have a nice living room here. So, you want a cup of tea?
Yeah, I feel like I'm on Oprah. I really enjoy this.
So, thank you all for being here. I'm Davide from ECHN, and here we have Kate from Topia, Barcelona. And we want to introduce you to the main results and outputs of the MakersXchange program. I'm gonna ask if we can. Yes? 1 second.
Presentation again, sorry.
Sorry?
Presentation file.
Yes. So maybe we really need a tea.
Me too.
Well, maybe I can already start describing the main, like the core of the Max project, which has been a pilot project, a pilot policy project that wanted to support cross-sectoral mobility for makers and to embed this mobility in European policies that foster skills development and social inclusion for makers. So during the duration of the project, we undertook several initiatives. First of all, we launched our own mobility scheme for makers, hyperlocal, hyperglobal, which will be explained later on by Kate. But we also did a lot of research and analysis. So we collected a lot of data and information from the participants of the mobility. We collected their feedback. We also collected a series of impact case studies of already existing remarkable examples of mobility. And we did a mapping of the mobility schemes in Europe. So with all these data, we got a proper overview of the current state of mobility schemes in Europe, and we identified the shortfalls and the good practices that we need to keep into consideration. With all these, we also set up creative policy workshop with policymakers and stakeholders from the industry, and we tried to co-design solutions to these shortfalls we identified. Here it is. This is not working. Can you? Yes, thank you. And lastly, we had the search mobility tool. So this is an online repository of existing opportunities for makers. And this is accessible through the Max project website. But then I will explain you later on how we plan to upgrade this tool beyond Max. So let's start debunking makers' mobility step by step. And so first of all, the first step we had to do in Max was defining makers, which is a very ambiguous term. So for the purposes of our project, we use the term makers in a very broad sense. So as you can see in the picture, makers exist at the intersection of different fields, different backgrounds and expertise. So we have architecture, engineering, DIY practices, applied arts, and so on. And this is the foundation of the Max project. The very nature of a maker, the richness of a maker lies in its versatility and cross-sectoral nature. And why is mobility so important to makers? So after collecting feedback and interviews from makers, we identified 4 main points. First of all, inclusion and skills development. So with makers mobility, we bridge different areas of Europe, like central cities and peripheral areas. And in this way, we give the chance to more disadvantaged areas of Europe to access technology and know-how that they couldn't access otherwise. The second point is community building and networking, because of course mobility brings people together, and this helps us solidify the makers community, and in this way it's easier to approach policymakers and the general public as a solid community. The third point is capacity building and self-evaluation, because in a mobility exchange, makers have the chance to do their practice in a different context with different peers, and this allows them to reflect on the hows and whys of their practice. And lastly, international promotion, because of course with mobility, makers have the chance to expand their network and find new professional opportunities. So now I'm going to guide you through the main outcomes of our mapping of makers mobility schemes in Europe. And we analyzed a big sample of already existing schemes through a series of metrics that I'm going to present you now. The first one is the geographical scope. So what we did was giving a distribution value to every European country that was calculated through 3 main indicators. First of all, where a mobility program is located. For instance, a residency program in Portugal. So Portugal scores 1 point. The second indicator is from which countries applicants to a mobility scheme can come from. For instance, a residency in Portugal open just to Portuguese, Spanish, and French people. And we saw this was a recurrent trend in our sample. Then we have countries included in distributed mobility schemes. In fact, there are some mobility schemes that are not focusing on one specific country, but for instance, Nordic Baltic countries. So by combining these indicators, we came up with a distribution value for each country. And as you can see in the map, the Western and Northern countries have the highest values. France and Germany are on the lead with 25 points, whereas the Eastern and Southern countries have a lower value. Some countries have 0 value, so they are excluded from the current situation. And interestingly enough, also central countries, but microstates like Andorra, Liechtenstein, they also score 0 points. Although they are central in Europe, somehow they're always excluded from these international initiatives. The second metric is duration. So in our sample, we identified 2 kinds of mobility, one with a fixed amount of days, on average 90 days, and another group with a flexible duration, so a range from 2 weeks to 3 months. The third metric was financial coverage. So as you can see, the majority of the mobility schemes offer a fee or a stipend to the makers participating, and roughly half of the sample offers a coverage for travel costs, accommodation, food. Just a very low percentage offers coverage for visa costs, and another short percentage is against the trend because they ask for a participation fee. But luckily, this is just a short percentage. As for funds, in the graph on your left, you can see that the blue part corresponds to self-funded mobility programs, which is the majority, whereas the green part represents EU-funded mobility programs. There's also an important representation of national or private funds, and there's a small percentage of volunteers. So mobility programs are managed by volunteers. In the other graph on your right, you can see that most of the mobility programs give money to participants through a lump sum, but there's also the possibility to have monthly, daily, or weekly fees, and other ways of distributing money depending on the specific project of the makers. The target audience, this is an interesting aspect. So in most of the cases, makers can participate as individuals. But 30% of the sample also offers a possibility of exchange for groups and collective.
And in which we need to be resilient. So this was quite interesting, and it gave a twist to our original planning. But it meant that we could develop 2 different rounds of piloting the mobility scheme. So we designed 30 exchanges in total. We had first a group of 10, which did online exchanges only, which kind of almost bred a new form, we saw as a new form of mobility, which is a hybrid form of mobility. So they were practicing locally and exchanging information skills online. And then when we were able to, we opened to physical exchange as well. So we had a second round in which we had 5 online and 15 exchanging physically. So it's part of all of these. We designed the pilot scheme to kind of reflect the findings that Davide talked about. And we enabled different kinds and formats of approach to the pilot scheme. So you could apply either as individuals, as an individual and a hub, or as 2 creative hubs or spaces. Everybody who had participated, each of the groups received a stipend for their participation, which they could use for travel or materials and equipment. And each of the exchanges were asked to host a final event in order to disseminate and diffuse their experiences. So I'm going to give just an outline of 3 of the experiences that we had, 3 of the different kinds of exchanges, in order to show some of the kinds of things which were experienced. And then later on we have a session in the next parallel sessions where we will hear from some of the makers who were involved. So quickly, just to show the kind of diversity in the applications, we had, obviously, as Davide talked about, we tried to include a wide range of countries in the applications that came. We also made an effort with our jury to understand, and in the selection process, to understand a balance in between male and female participants. And of course, we also wanted to ensure we had a split between the different formats. So we had maker and maker, maker and hub, and then hub and hub. So the first experience that I wanted to bring was one by Camillo and Andre from Fab Lab Benfica. So this was one in which the idea of the hybrid exchange kind of really came through strongly. We had Camillo, who was in the Czech Republic, and we had Andre, who was in Lisbon, in Portugal. And Andre was working with the Fab Lab in Benfica, and Camillo provided a workshop online to the students who were practicing physically in the space in Fab Lab Benfica. So this meant that Camillo could exchange skills at distance and his knowledge with the students who were practicing locally in their own space. So this one was undertaken during COVID. It was in our first round, and it really shows the way in which this kind of exchange in which makers are sharing the skills and knowledge can really impact locally with a community. Secondly, this is one of our physical exchanges that happened once borders opened and our applicants could actually travel. So this was one that was undertaken by a project called Rural Hackers and a co-working space in Galicia. So they travelled to this small remote community and developed a co-design project with the community to help them to develop a hardware and software system to track water usage in their town. So this is really interesting if we look at the way in which these kinds of mobility schemes can be able to enact and really engage with remote communities, bringing skills, bringing knowledge and connecting them on a wider scale. And this was really, really successful, and the team also uploaded everything to GitHub. Everything is open source, so as well as the one before, so that you can actually access this and then participate and learn from this project by the rural hackers. And they're continuing this project, also thanks to the work that they did inside the Hyperlocal, Hyperglobal Exchange. Finally, I wanted to bring this one, which is by Joanna and Lotto Zero, and I know that Tessa is also here, so she was also involved in this project. This one is interesting. It bridges kind of the traditional crafts approach that makers are often involved with a digital layer. So this project enabled Joanna to learn different varieties of skills online and then practice those skills digitally in person in her studio. So this was a really interesting approach because it also was focused around really looking at sustainability as a driver of this research. So we see an exchange of skills, we see the ability to focus really well and really neatly on these kinds of pressing issues that we are looking to do as makers. We're looking to have this impact in the world. So I think this is a really nice one, and it also is a really great example of how the maker movement is really bridging crafts, traditional crafts, with the digital space. Finally, I just wanted to bring a couple of feedbacks from these makers, and also another one which was in Greece with Habibi Works, just to show a little bit the kind of feedback we got from the makers. And it is really based on what Davide was saying before, which is about, you know, this connection to developing skills, this connection to having impact. And as the guys from the Rural Hackers Project say, they talk about how they can support projects in rural areas and how their work can actually deliver to rural areas through this kind of hybridization and the ability to travel as well through MakersXchange. And then I wanted to bring this really nice one on your right, which is from another project which was by Habibi Works, which again brought together digital crafts and traditional clay making skills. And they really talked about this idea of the direct benefits which are linked to this kind of exchange. So not just the exchange that happens in person, but also the ongoing and knock-on effects which can occur into the communities when we have makers traveling and engaging in person with communities. So I think this is it. Back to you, Davide.
Thank you. So in light of all this, Max came up with a series of recommendations summarized here in 10 points. And I think this is one of the main, the most important takeaways of the whole Max experience, because it really summarizes every action we took. So very quickly, let's go through it. The first point is consider co-designing your open calls. So of course, makers are the first ones knowing their needs and their expectations regarding mobility, so involving them in the design process of a mobility scheme is vital. The second point is target a diverse group of participants. So as we said, makers by definition are cross-sectoral, so we need to make sure that the participants represent the diversity of the industry. Then open to minority groups to pursue an inclusive program. Facilitate participation. In fact, the bureaucratic humdrum is very often a barrier of participation for makers, so minimizing that would allow a bigger participation. Make it last. In fact, very often makers complain for the fact that the duration of mobility is not long enough to finalize a very complex project that often consists in prototyping, experimenting, and this requires time. Point 6 is going hybrid. We experimented this, of course, during the pandemic, and this format is very useful also for the pre and after phase of an exchange, but I'm gonna discuss this later on. Point 7 is consider a broad financial coverage. So the travel cost is the staple, is the basic aspect of a mobility. But of course, there are many other aspects like visa support, family support in case a maker wants to travel with a family along. Then we have monitor and evaluate. This is very important to keep track of the participants' experience, to collect their feedback in order to reiterate a new round of mobility improved. Set up an open repository. In fact, makers always work, they embrace the open source culture. They share the outcomes of their projects, and so it's important to implement this also in every mobility scheme. And finally, connect with an international platform to elevate the Makers Mobility Scheme visibility and to offer new possibilities for the participants. So, in conclusion, I want to give just a few clarifications. Firstly, as I mentioned before, we plan to upgrade the search mobility tool. Now it's accessible on the MakersXchange website, where you can see this interactive list of opportunities of mobility. It's interactive because people can actively add new opportunities, but we want this tool to exist beyond Max. So we plan to incorporate this tool into the Creatives Unite platform, which will exist beyond Max. And then I think it's worth mentioning how an EU-funded program like Max needs to be flexible enough to adapt and react to urgency situations. We faced several in the last couple of years, and I think it's really important to reflect together on how we can come up with different solutions to face these situations, which will happen again in the future probably. So the first urgency we had to face, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and this outbreak was a big obstacle for international mobility. So Max found some solutions. We created an online and hybrid format of mobility. This turned out being quite a valid alternative to physical mobility, and what we learned is that the hybrid format can exist also beyond the pandemic. In fact, offering a hybrid format allows participants to exchange before the physical exchange, so that there's a preparatory phase, but also after to follow up the next steps of the project. We also collected some suggestions from the participants of our mobility. They suggested vaccination and testing coverage, longer stays for fewer people, local travels and exchanges instead of international ones. So this shows how makers themselves embody the flexibility needed to face these situations, because makers live in this liminal situation, and so by nature they need to be flexible and resourceful. So this is a richness for us. Now I want to invite Andrei from ECHN to introduce another strategy we implemented within ECHN.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation, Davide and Kate. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, again. Yes, I wanted to, following the MakersXchange final results presentation, I wanted, and I'm happy to announce the special mobility program, which is designed for Ukrainian displaced creatives who were displaced by the war. This program is specially designed to provide the professional help and to help to go on with the professional development and going on with working already for those people who are already in Europe. 27 Ukrainian artists and creatives will be provided with the assistance of 1,000 euros, and as well as facilities from Hub's network with the development of skills, with promotion, and of course networking. So actually that's it. Officially, open call starts the next Monday on the 13th of June. Feel free to share this information. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you see, we have some important takeaways from the MAX project. If you are planning to set up a mobility scheme for makers, keep all these into consideration. And thank you all.